Jake Thompson had always been a man of ambition. Growing up in a modest household, he learned early on that opportunities didn't just fall into your lap. You had to chase them with everything you had. By the time he turned 40, Jake had built himself a comfortable life. He owned a small but thriving power company, one he'd poured his heart and soul into for years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it allowed him to provide for his family while doing something meaningful. When Jake decided to buy a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, it felt like the perfect next step. The home wasn't extravagant. It was cozy, with enough space for him to relax after long days at work. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns, kids played outside until sunset, and neighbors greeted each other with polite smiles. For someone who had spent most of his adult life hustling, this seemed like the ideal place to finally slow down. At first, things went smoothly. Jake introduced himself to his new neighbors, exchanging pleasantries over coffee or during evening walks. Most people were friendly, welcoming him warmly to the community. But there was one person who stood out, Karen Hargrove. Everyone knew Karen. She was the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, a role she took very seriously. Some might even say, too seriously. Karen was known around the neighborhood as HOA Karen. While some residents appreciated her efforts to keep things orderly, others found her rules excessive. She once fined a family for having their Christmas lights up past January 15th. Another time, she sent a strongly worded letter to a homeowner because their mailbox leaned slightly to the left. To Karen, every detail mattered, and she wasn't shy about enforcing her vision of perfection. Jake tried to stay out of her way. He figured if he kept his property tidy and followed the HOA guidelines, he wouldn't have any issues. After all, he had enough on his plate running his business. But deep down, he couldn't help but notice how Karen carried herself. She walked through the neighborhood like she owned it, clipboard in hand, inspecting every blade of grass and scrutinizing every paint color. Jake admired her dedication, but there was something about her demeanor that rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the smug smile she wore when telling someone they were breaking a rule, or maybe it was the way she dismissed anyone who dared to question her authority. Whatever it was, Jake made a mental note to avoid crossing paths with her whenever possible. Life in the suburbs had its charm, though. Jake enjoyed tending to his garden on weekends, listening to birds chirp while sipping his morning coffee. He liked waving to joggers passing by and chatting with the elderly couple across the street, who always seemed happy to share stories about their grandchildren. This was the kind of simple, peaceful existence he'd dreamed of. But little did Jake know trouble was brewing right under his nose, or rather, on his property. One sunny afternoon, as he strolled along the edge of his backyard to check on a patch of flowers he'd recently planted, he noticed something unusual. There, near the fence that separated his land from Karen's, stood a large metal box. It looked bulky and out of place, almost like it didn't belong there. Curious, Jake approached it cautiously. The object was a transformer, an electrical device used to regulate voltage. Transformers weren't uncommon in neighborhoods, but they were usually placed on utility poles or in designated areas far from residential properties. This one, however, was sitting squarely on his land, close enough to cast a shadow over his flower bed. Jake frowned. He hadn't authorized anyone to put it there, and he certainly hadn't seen it before moving in. Confused, Jake pulled out his phone and called the local utility company. Surely they would know why this thing was suddenly on his property. But when he spoke to a representative, he got an unexpected answer. The utility company claimed they weren't responsible for installing it. In fact, they had no record of any recent projects in Jake's area. This revelation left Jake even more puzzled. If the utility company didn't put it there, then who did? Jake's mind raced as he tried to piece together what might have happened. Had someone made a mistake? Was this some sort of prank? Or worse, could it be dangerous? Transformers dealt with high-voltage electricity, and improper installation could pose serious risks. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. Something about this situation didn't sit right. Later that evening, as Jake sat on his porch mulling over the mystery, he overheard snippets of conversation drifting from Karen's yard next door. She was hosting a small gathering with a few neighbors, her voice carrying clearly through the warm summer air. At one point, she proudly declared, "I took care of that voltage issue everyone was complaining about. Problem solved." Her tone was triumphant, as if she'd single-handedly saved the neighborhood from certain doom. Jake froze. A voltage issue? Could Karen have anything to do with the mysterious transformer? The thought seemed absurd at first. Why would she install such a thing without permission? But the more Jake thought about it, the more plausible it became. Karen loved being in control, and she wasn't above bending rules to get what she wanted. If she believed the transformer would solve a problem or boost her reputation among neighbors, she might not have hesitated to take matters into her own hands. Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. What had started as a peaceful day had quickly turned into a puzzle he couldn't ignore. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would confront Karen and demand answers. Until then, the transformer loomed ominously in his backyard, a silent reminder that, sometimes even in the quietest corners of suburbia, drama finds a way to creep in. The next morning, Jake woke up with a sense of unease. The transformer in his backyard was still there, casting its metallic shadow over the grass. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just about the inconvenience. It was the principle of the matter. Someone had placed a large, potentially hazardous piece of equipment on his private property without asking for permission. That wasn't just rude. It was illegal. Jake decided to dig deeper. As someone who worked in the power industry, he knew transformers weren't things you could casually slap onto someone's land. They required permits, inspections, and adherence to strict safety regulations. If Karen or anyone else had bypassed these steps, they were putting not only his property but also the entire neighborhood at risk. His first step was to do some online research. Jake spent hours poring over local zoning laws and utility company guidelines. He discovered that installing a transformer required approval from multiple agencies, including the City Planning Department and the State Energy Commission. There was no record of such approvals being granted for his address. This confirmed his suspicions. Whoever installed the transformer hadn't followed proper procedures. But what really caught Jake's attention was an article he stumbled upon while searching for information. It detailed a case where an unlicensed contractor had improperly installed a transformer, leading to a dangerous electrical surge that damaged several homes. Reading this sent a chill down Jake's spine. Was his neighborhood unknowingly sitting on a ticking time bomb? Determined to get answers, Jake decided to visit the local government offices in person. He figured face-to-face conversations might yield more results than phone calls or emails. After parking his car near the municipal building, he walked inside, clutching a folder filled with notes and printouts. At the counter, he explained his situation to a clerk who directed him to the zoning department. There, Jake met a helpful woman named Lisa, who listened intently as he described the mysterious transformer. She pulled up records for his neighborhood and confirmed what he already suspected. There was no permit issued for any transformer installation at his address. However, she did mention seeing a recent application for improvements submitted by the HOA. When Jake asked for details, Lisa hesitated but eventually handed over a copy of the document. As Jake scanned the paperwork, his jaw dropped. The application was signed by none other than Karen Hargrove. It outlined plans to install a transformer on communal land to improve power distribution, but nowhere did it mention Jake's property. Clearly, Karen had misrepresented the location, either intentionally or through sheer negligence. Armed with this new evidence, Jake returned home, his mind racing. He now had proof that Karen was involved, but he needed more before confronting her directly. His next move was to speak with neighbors. Surely, someone must have noticed something unusual happening during the transformer's installation. Over the course of the afternoon, Jake knocked on doors explaining his predicament and showing them photos of the transformer. Most people were sympathetic, though a few seemed hesitant to comment. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, finally provided a breakthrough. She recalled seeing a truck parked near Jake's backyard a few weeks earlier. Two men unloaded heavy equipment and Karen had been standing nearby giving instructions. She kept saying it was urgent, Mrs. Peterson told Jake. She said it was for the good of the neighborhood. This revelation infuriated Jake. Urgent or not, Karen had no right to make decisions involving his property without consulting him. What made matters worse was the casual way she dismissed the rights of others. To her, it seemed the ends always justified the means. That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table surrounded by documents, notes, and photographs. He felt like a detective piecing together clues in a mystery novel. Everything pointed back to Karen. But why would she go to such lengths? Did she genuinely believe the transformer would benefit the neighborhood, or was there another motive at play? Jake remembered overhearing Karen boast about solving the voltage issue. Maybe she saw this as an opportunity to boost her reputation among neighbors. Perhaps she thought taking decisive action, even if it meant bending rules, would solidify her status as the ultimate authority figure in the community. Whatever her reasoning, Jake realized that Karen's actions weren't just careless, they were calculated. Before heading to bed, Jake drafted a list of questions he wanted to ask Karen. He knew confrontation wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't the type to admit wrongdoing, especially when cornered. Still, Jake felt confident in his preparation. He had facts, documents, and witness statements, all pointing to Karen's involvement in the illegal installation. As he turned off the lights and climbed into bed, Jake replayed the day's events in his mind. The discovery of the transformer had started as a minor annoyance, but it had quickly spiraled into something much bigger. Tomorrow, he would confront Karen head-on. Whether she liked it or not, Jake was determined to uncover the truth and put an end to this mess once and for all. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Jake tossed and turned, imagining how the conversation might unfold. Would Karen deny everything? Try to intimidate him? Or perhaps even double down on her claims of acting for the greater good? No matter what happened, Jake knew one thing for certain: he wasn't backing down. Not when his property, and possibly the safety of his neighbors, was at stake. The sun rose early the next day, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jake sipped his coffee slowly, gathering his thoughts. Today marked the beginning of a battle he hadn't anticipated when he moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood. Little did he know, the fight ahead would test his patience, his resolve, and ultimately, his ability to stand up for what was right, even against someone as formidable as Karen Hargrove. The morning air was crisp as Jake stepped out of his house, determination etched across his face. He had spent the previous night preparing for this moment, rehearsing what he would say and how he would present his case. Armed with documents, photos, and witness statements, he felt ready to confront Karen Hargrove about the illegal transformer on his property. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation. Karen wasn't someone who took criticism lightly, let alone admitted fault. Jake walked over to Karen's house, which sat just a few doors down from his. Her immaculately manicured lawn and freshly painted white picket fence stood in stark contrast to the chaos brewing in Jake's mind. He rang the doorbell twice before hearing footsteps approach from inside. The door swung open, revealing Karen, dressed in her usual polished attire, a pastel sweater set paired with khakis. She held a clipboard under one arm, as if perpetually ready to inspect something or hand out a citation. "Jake," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "What brings you here?" "I need to talk to you about something important," Jake replied firmly. "Can we sit down for a minute?" Karen hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the seriousness in his tone. After a brief pause, she nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. They settled into her living room where framed certificates of HOA service lined the walls like trophies. Jake couldn't help but notice how every detail in Karen's home seemed curated to project authority and control. "So, what's this about?" Karen asked, folding her hands neatly on her lap. Her smile was polite, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "It's about the transformer that's been installed on my property," Jake began, cutting straight to the point. "I know you're behind it." Karen's expression shifted ever so slightly, though she tried to mask it. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know anything about a transformer." Jake leaned forward, placing the folder he'd brought onto the coffee table between them. Let me show you. He opened it and slid a series of documents toward her. This is a copy of the application you submitted to the city for improvements. It mentions installing a transformer, but nowhere does it say it's on my land. Karen glanced at the papers, her lips tightening into a thin line. For a moment she said nothing, her confidence wavering. Finally she spoke, her voice sharper now. Even if I did submit that application, it doesn't mean I broke any rules. Sometimes adjustments have to be made for the greater good. The greater good? Jake repeated, incredulous. You can't just decide to put something on someone else's property without their permission. That's not how it works. And besides, there's no permit for this installation. It's completely illegal. Karen waved dismissively, attempting to regain her composure. Oh, come on, Jake, don't be so dramatic. This isn't hurting anyone. In fact, it's helping stabilize the power supply in the neighborhood. You should be thanking me. Jake stared at her, stunned by her audacity. Helping? You didn't even consult me. Do you have any idea how dangerous this could be? Improperly installed transformers can cause electrical surges or worse, fires. Karen rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed by his concerns. You're exaggerating. Everything is fine. The contractor assured me it's safe. And who exactly is this contractor? Jake pressed, narrowing his eyes. Because according to my research, they aren't licensed to do this kind of work. Now Karen looked genuinely uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat, avoiding eye contact. Look, Jake, I'm not going to argue with you about technicalities. What matters is that the neighborhood has better power now. Isn't that worth a little inconvenience? A little inconvenience? Jake echoed, his frustration bubbling over. Karen, this is my property. You don't get to decide what happens to it. If you wanted to improve the neighborhood, you should have gone through the proper channels instead of taking shortcuts. Karen sighed dramatically, as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. Fine, Jake. If it means that much to you, I'll look into moving it. But honestly, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Jake shook his head, exasperated. It's not just about moving it, it's about accountability. You broke the law, Karen, and if you think I'm going to let this slide, you're mistaken. For the first time since their conversation began, Karen's mask of indifference cracked. Her cheeks flushed red, and her voice rose an octave. Are you threatening me, Jake? Because let me tell you something. No, I'm not threatening you, Jake interrupted calmly, though his jaw was clenched. I'm simply stating facts. You installed an illegal transformer on my land without my consent. That's trespassing, and if you refuse to take responsibility, I'll have no choice but to escalate this. Karen scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. Escalate what? Go ahead, Jake. See if anyone cares. Everyone in this neighborhood knows I'm the one keeping things running smoothly around here. They trust me. Jake leaned back, studying her carefully. He realized then that Karen's motivations ran deeper than mere convenience or community spirit. This was about power, the kind that came from controlling others. She thrived on being indispensable, on having neighbors depend on her for solutions, whether they liked it or not. To admit wrongdoing would chip away at the image she'd worked so hard to cultivate. You may think you're untouchable, Karen, Jake said evenly. But people value honesty more than manipulation. When they find out what you've done, they won't see you as a hero. They'll see you as someone who abused her position. Karen's face hardened, all pretense of civility gone. You won't win this, Jake. Mark my words. With that, she stood up abruptly, signaling the end of their discussion. Jake gathered his documents and rose to leave, feeling a mix of anger and satisfaction. He hadn't expected Karen to back down easily, but at least he'd planted a seed of doubt. Now it was time to take the next step, presenting his findings to the rest of the HOA board. As Jake walked back to his house, his mind raced with possibilities. How would the other members react when they learned the truth? Would they side with Karen, blinded by loyalty, or would they demand accountability? One thing was certain. This confrontation had only scratched the surface. The real battle was yet to come. Despite the tension, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. Standing up to Karen wasn't just about reclaiming his property. It was about reminding everyone in the neighborhood, including Karen herself, that No one was above the rules. Even in a quiet suburban setting, justice mattered, and Jake was determined to see it served. Jake knew that confronting Karen directly wasn't enough. She was too stubborn, too convinced of her own righteousness to admit fault or take action voluntarily. If he wanted to resolve this issue once and for all, he needed to dig deeper and make sure the truth couldn't be ignored. That meant gathering more evidence, connecting the dots, and exposing Karen's actions in a way that left no room for denial. The first step was to track down the contractor who had installed the transformer. Jake remembered Mrs. Peterson mentioning seeing workers near his backyard, so he revisited her for more details. The elderly neighbor recalled snippets of their conversation, including the name of the company scrawled on the side of their truck. Quick Fix Electric. It wasn't a well-known brand, which immediately raised red flags in Jake's mind. Legitimate electrical contractors usually operated under recognizable names with proper licensing and certifications. Armed with this clue, Jake turned to the internet. A quick search revealed that Quick Fix Electric wasn't registered with the State Energy Commission, nor did they hold any valid licenses to perform high-voltage installations. Even worse, the company had a string of complaints filed against them for shoddy workmanship and unsafe practices. Jake made a mental note to document everything. He'd need this information later. Next, Jake decided to reach out to the contractor directly. Using the phone number listed on their website, which looked hastily thrown together, he called pretending to be a potential customer. When asked about recent projects, the person on the other end became evasive, claiming they couldn't discuss private jobs. But after some gentle prodding, Jake managed to extract a crucial detail. The job at his house had been commissioned by someone named Karen Hargrove, who promised additional payments from HOA funds if the work was completed quickly. This revelation confirmed what Jake had suspected all along. Karen hadn't just arranged for the transformer to be installed. She had incentivized the contractor to cut corners. Whether it was out of impatience, greed, or sheer arrogance, she had knowingly compromised safety protocols to get what she wanted. Jake felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay focused. He jotted down notes, ensuring every piece of evidence was meticulously documented. With the contractor angle covered, Jake shifted his attention to Karen's emails. While snooping around online, he stumbled upon a public records request portal where residents could access correspondence related to HOA business. After submitting a formal inquiry, he received a batch of emails exchanged between Karen and various parties, including the contractor. What he found was damning. In one email thread, Karen explicitly instructed the contractor to prioritize speed over permits, writing, "We don't have time for bureaucratic delays. Just get it done ASAP, and I'll handle the paperwork later." Another message included vague promises of financial compensation, hinting at unauthorized use of HOA funds. Jake printed out copies of these emails, highlighting key phrases that underscored Karen's recklessness. But Jake didn't stop there. As someone familiar with power infrastructure, he understood the technical risks associated with improper installations. To further bolster his case, he contacted a trusted colleague from his own company, an experienced engineer named Mark, to inspect the transformer. Together, they conducted a thorough assessment, documenting multiple violations of safety standards. For instance, the transformer lacked proper grounding, increasing the risk of electrical surges. Additionally, its placement violated setback requirements designed to protect nearby structures from potential hazards. Mark provided Jake with a detailed report outlining these findings, complete with diagrams and photographic evidence. By the time Jake finished compiling everything, he had amassed an arsenal of proof: unlicensed contractors, falsified applications, misleading emails, and blatant disregard for safety regulations. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of Karen's misconduct, leaving little doubt about her culpability. However, Jake also recognized that facts alone wouldn't sway everyone. Many neighbors still viewed Karen as a pillar of authority, someone who worked tirelessly to maintain order in the community. Convincing them to turn against her would require not only solid evidence but also emotional appeal. So, Jake took the Time to craft a narrative that highlighted the broader implications of Karen's actions, not just for him personally, but for the entire neighborhood. He drafted a presentation summarizing his discoveries, framing it as a story of negligence and accountability. He started with the basics: how the transformer ended up on his property without permission, why it posed a danger, and who was responsible. Then, he transitioned into the bigger picture, emphasizing how Karen's decisions jeopardized everyone's safety. He included quotes from concerned neighbors like Mrs. Peterson, who expressed unease about the rushed installation process. Finally, he concluded with a call to action, urging the HOA board to demand transparency and enforce consequences for breaking the rules. By the time Jake finished preparing his materials, he felt confident in his ability to present a compelling case. Still, he anticipated resistance. Karen had spent years cultivating influence within the community, and undoing that wouldn't happen overnight. Some board members might hesitate to challenge her, fearing backlash or division among residents. Others might dismiss the issue altogether, chalking it up to harmless oversight. To address these concerns, Jake reached out to a few sympathetic neighbors beforehand, sharing his findings and encouraging them to attend the upcoming HOA meeting. He knew that having allies in the room would strengthen his position and help counteract any attempts by Karen to deflect blame. Among those he approached was Mrs. Peterson, whose eyewitness account added credibility to his claims. On the morning of the meeting, Jake arrived early, setting up a projector and arranging handouts for attendees. As neighbors trickled in, he greeted each person warmly, striking up casual conversations about everyday topics: gardening tips, local events, school activities. These small interactions helped humanize him, reminding everyone that he was simply another resident trying to protect his home and community. When Karen walked in, flanked by two loyal supporters, Jake noticed the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Her presence commanded attention, but there was an edge of defensiveness in her posture. She scanned the crowd, likely counting heads and gauging support. When her eyes met Jake's, she gave him a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. As the meeting began, Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. This wasn't just about shutting down Karen. It was about restoring trust and integrity to the neighborhood. With his folder of evidence in hand and determination in his heart, he stepped forward to speak. Whatever happened next, he was ready. The stage was set, and Jake knew he had one chance to make his voice heard. The truth was on his side, and he intended to wield it wisely. The HOA meeting room buzzed with murmurs as Jake stood at the front, his folder of evidence resting on the table in front of him. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile glow across the faces of the attendees, some curious, others skeptical. Karen sat near the back, flanked by her usual supporters, her expression unreadable but tense. Jake could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, and for a moment he hesitated. But then he reminded himself why he was here: to protect not just his property, but the safety and integrity of the entire neighborhood. "Thank you all for coming today," Jake began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "I know many of you are wondering why we're gathered here, so let me get straight to the point. A few weeks ago, I discovered something unusual on my property: a transformer installed without my knowledge or consent." He paused, letting the words sink in. A ripple of surprise moved through the room as neighbors exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, intrigued. Others looked confused, clearly unaware of what Jake was referring to. "This isn't just about inconvenience," Jake continued, pacing slowly to maintain eye contact with different members of the audience. "It's about accountability. Someone decided it was okay to place a potentially hazardous piece of equipment on private land without following proper procedures, or even asking permission. And when I started investigating, I uncovered a lot, more than I bargained for." Jake opened his folder and held up the first document, the fake application Karen had submitted to the city. "This is an application filed under the HOA's name, supposedly for improvements to stabilize power distribution in the neighborhood. Notice anything odd? It mentions installing a transformer, but nowhere does it say it would be placed on my property, Yet that's exactly where it ended up. He let the implications hang in the air before moving on to the next piece of evidence. Projecting an email exchange onto the screen behind him, he highlighted key lines from Karen's correspondence with the unlicensed contractor. Here's where things get concerning. Not only did Karen arrange for this installation herself, but she also pressured the contractor to skip permits and prioritize speed over safety. She promised them additional payments from HOA funds if they completed the job quickly. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors whispered among themselves, while others stared at Karen, waiting for her reaction. Her face remained impassive, though her knuckles tightened around the pen in her hand. Jake pressed on, knowing he had their attention now. But it gets worse. When I inspected the transformer with a licensed engineer, we found multiple violations of safety standards. It lacks proper grounding, which increases the risk of electrical surges. Its placement violates setback requirements meant to protect nearby homes. Bottom line, this thing is dangerous. Not just for me, but for everyone in the area. To drive home the severity of the situation, Jake shared photos of similar cases where improperly installed transformers had caused fires or damaged properties. He described how such incidents could happen here too, painting a vivid picture of what might occur if nothing was done. Do any of you want to wake up one morning to find your house damaged, or worse, because of shortcuts taken for convenience? The room grew quieter, the gravity of his words settling over the group. Even Karen's closest allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy looks. Jake sensed the tide turning, but he wasn't finished yet. I didn't come here tonight to vilify anyone, he said, softening his tone slightly. I came here because I believe in transparency and fairness. We're a community, and our strength lies in working together, not in bending rules or hiding mistakes. What happened here wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate decision made by someone who thought they were above the law. At this, Karen finally spoke up, rising to her feet with a forced smile. Jake, I understand your concerns, but let's not blow this out of proportion. Yes, there may have been some oversights, but my intentions were good. I was trying to help the neighborhood. Her voice carried a familiar note of deflection, but Jake was prepared for it. Intentions don't change facts, Karen, he replied, firmly. Good intentions don't excuse illegal actions. They certainly don't justify putting people's safety at risk. Karen's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of frustration. You're making this personal, she shot back, her tone sharper now. Instead of focusing on solutions, you're dragging us into drama. Jake shook his head, refusing to rise to the bait. This isn't personal, it's about principle. If we allow this kind of behavior to go unchecked, what message does that send? That it's okay to ignore rules as long as you think you're doing the right thing? His rebuttal drew nods of agreement from several attendees. Encouraged, Jake turned back to the board members seated at the head of the room. I'm asking the HOA to take immediate action. First, the transformer needs to be removed from my property and relocated to a safe, approved site. Second, Karen must answer for her role in this mess. Her actions violated not only zoning laws but also the trust we place in our leaders. For a moment, silence filled the room as everyone processed his request. Then one of the board members, a retired teacher named Mr. Alvarez, spoke up. Jake makes a compelling case, he said, addressing the group. We can't ignore the evidence he's presented. This isn't just about him, it affects all of us. Another neighbor chimed, voicing support for Jake's proposal. Slowly but surely, the tide began to shift. Even those who had initially sided with Karen seemed reluctant to defend her outright, given the overwhelming proof of wrongdoing. When it came time for a vote, the outcome was decisive. The board unanimously agreed to demand the removal of the transformer and launch a formal investigation into Karen's conduct. As the motion passed, Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't just vindication, it was validation that standing up for what's right could make a difference. Karen, meanwhile, sat rigidly in her chair, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. For once, she had no cutting remark, no clever deflection. The facade of authority she'd carefully constructed was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the meeting adjourned, Neighbors approached Jake to thank him for bringing the issue to light. Some admitted they'd suspected Karen of overstepping boundaries before but hadn't known how to address it. Others praised him for handling the situation calmly and professionally, avoiding unnecessary conflict. Walking home that night, Jake reflected on everything that had transpired. The battle wasn't entirely over yet. There would still be logistical hurdles to clear, and Karen wasn't likely to disappear quietly. But he'd accomplished what mattered most: exposing the truth and holding someone accountable. More importantly, he'd reminded everyone in the neighborhood that fairness and integrity weren't outdated ideals. They were values worth fighting for. In the days that followed, whispers of the scandal spread throughout the community. Neighbors, who had once feared crossing Karen, now spoke openly about their frustrations with her heavy-handed leadership style. The HOA, once dominated by her iron grip, began to transform into a more collaborative and transparent organization. And Jake, once just another quiet resident, emerged as a respected voice for change. Though he never sought the spotlight, Jake realized that sometimes stepping up meant taking risks, even when it meant challenging someone as formidable as Karen Hargrove. After all, communities thrived not because of individuals like Karen, who wielded power for personal gain, but because of people willing to stand up and say, "Enough is enough."